We have been studying over the last several weeks the prayers of Jesus, the various places in the Gospels where we are given that fly on the wall look into Jesus' prayer life. And we overhear just exactly the words that he said in prayer to his Father. Today we come to Jesus' final prayer that we have recorded for us. And of course that prayer comes as he hangs on the cross. Jesus shows us how to pray in this final prayer, how to pray when you're at the end of your rope, when you have absolutely nothing left, when all there is for you to do is pray. That's it. You have no other options. We read from Mark chapter 15. It says in verse 33, "At the 6th hour darkness came over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour Jesus cried in a loud voice, 'Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani,' which means, 'My God, why have you forsaken me?' When some of those standing near heard this, they said, 'Listen, he's calling Elijah.' One man ran, filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a stick, and offered it to Jesus to drink. 'Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down,' he said. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last." Jesus was fully God and fully man. This makes Christianity absolutely different, very different from any other religion. You see, because God became man. God is not sitting far above us, aloof from us, sitting so far above and untouched by our troubles. No, instead, God became a man and experienced all the troubles that we experience in this life. He lived just as we do. Jesus, the scriptures tell us, was tempted in all ways just like we were, and we are. Jesus, you see, suffered his time of doubt. Jesus cried out from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" But although he was human, Jesus wasn't sinful like us. He's not like the Greek gods. You see, the Greeks fashioned gods in their own image. They thought of the gods as like themselves, and so the Greek gods, if you'll remember some of the myths you may have learned in school, those Greek myths talk of the gods and how petty they are, and how childish they are, and how manipulative they are. They're like a bunch of kids just, scratching and clawing and messing with each other. No, that's not what Jesus is like. Jesus is not made in our image, but instead God became a man to show us how we are supposed to be, how were originally intended to be, because we were made in his image. And so Jesus, as a man, as fully experiencing all that we experience on this earth, Jesus also experienced doubt. You see, we all doubt. It does no good to pretend that it's not there. We can't just lie and say, well, I'm fine, it's all okay. It happens. We all have our doubts. We all have those days when we're not sure. Some days we know. Other days, we're not so sure. We each need to face our doubts. But more importantly, I think we each need to faith our doubts. How do you faith your doubts? Well, I think Jesus demonstrates it for us here in his final prayer. In order to faith your doubt, we see Jesus, first of all, we know that Jesus was prepared. You've got to be prepared for your doubt. You've got to know that it's going to come. There's come a day, it doesn't matter how firm you are in your faith, how much you know your Bible, how well you're doing in your beliefs. There's going to be days when you'll doubt. Be prepared for your doubts. Be prepared for your doubts through prayer. You see, we don't leave prayer to just be a last resort. Just to be that thing that, when you've tried everything else, when you've given it all that you got, when everything else fails, then read the instructions, right? No, when everything else, you can't do it, you've tried every which way, then you're going to pray. No, that's not the way that we should be approaching our Lord. That's not the example that Jesus set us. The idea that when you've done everything you can and when nothing else has worked, then pray. That's the mentality behind the saying that, he hasn't got a prayer. Basically, even the very last resort available to a person is no option at all. Jesus was prepared for his doubts. Jesus had spent a lifetime in prayer. He had cultivated his relationship with the Father. He had spent countless hours in prayer to the Father. And so when it came down to the most difficult time of his life, when it was the most stressful time, it was a natural response that Jesus cried out to God. So be prepared for your doubts through prayer. But also be prepared for your doubts through the Bible, through Scriptures. You see, Jesus had not only spent a lifetime in prayer, he had spent a lifetime in the Scriptures, and he knew the Scriptures. And so here he calls out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Which is actually a quote from Psalm 22. Jesus knew the psalm, and he knew that it expressed what he needed to say, and so he spoke the words of the psalm. Be prepared for your doubt through prayer and through the Scriptures, but also through knowing your purpose. You see, Jesus had also spent a lifetime heading for this exact moment. He had been telling his disciples it was going to come, that he was going to go to Jerusalem, that he was going to be arrested and tried and executed. Jesus knew he was called to this. But despite all of that, Jesus still had his moment of doubt. Jesus knew the Father. He was intimately involved with him and close to him in prayer. Jesus knew the Psalms. He knew the Scriptures. He was able to quote them in his hour of need. Jesus knew his mission. He knew he was exactly where he was supposed to be and doing exactly what he had to do, dying on that cross. But none of that excludes Jesus from doubt. The doubts still come. You see, and it's going to happen with us too. We can take great comfort in that even Jesus doubted. So now all of a sudden, okay, when I have those doubts, then that doesn't mean there's something wrong with me. Doesn't mean that my faith is defective. Doesn't mean that I haven't done my homework. It means that I'm human. So be prepared for your doubts. Be prepared because they're going to come. You can expect that. Then be honest with your doubt. Don't beat yourself up for having those thoughts. Don't think that, there's something wrong with me. No. Be honest about it and express that to God. And if you have trouble expressing it, if you don't find the words, then you may find the words in the Psalms. It's times like that written prayers can be very helpful for us. That's what Jesus did. Jesus turned to the Psalms. He's at his lowest ebb, his worst point in his life, and here he quotes from the Psalms. He goes to the Scriptures to express what he needs to say. You may read in the Psalms and you can say, yes, that's exactly what I'm feeling. That's exactly where I am. I've given you a few examples and suggestions there in your bulletin. In Psalm 22, for instance, what Jesus prays. Psalm 22 says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from the words of my groaning? Jesus cries out because God is not responding to him. And maybe you've been there. And if you haven't been there, well, there will probably come a day in the future when you will be there. When you're calling out to God and he doesn't seem to be responding. And it doesn't make sense that God is allowing the circumstance that you're in. Why is he letting all these things happen to me? What is the problem here? What have I done to deserve this? The psalm expresses that. Or you may try Psalm 42. In Psalm 42, verses 3 and 4, it says, my tears have been my food day and night, while men say to me all day long, where is your God? These things I remember as I pour out my soul, how I used to go with the multitude, leading the procession to the house of God, with shouts of joy and thanksgiving among the festive throng. There the psalmist writes, and we can relate, I believe, as we think, you remember the good times. You can remember when, boy, I was so full of faith and I was so sure of my faith and I just knew I could take on the world back then. And you remember when your faith was so strong, and you remember when you went gladly to worship, and you remember all those glory days, and that just makes this current time that much worse. Because you think, why isn't it like that now? Why can't I be like I was when I was so certain? And then that brings on the guilt. The guilt that you must have really messed up something. The guilt that says, well, I've really wandered away from God. I really must be sinful. Something must be terribly wrong. To faith your doubts, we begin by preparing beforehand. We continue by being honest with those doubts. But then we also have to be alone with our doubts. You can expect others not to get it. People will misunderstand. As Jesus cried out, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, they said, oh, he's calling Elijah. They didn't get it at all. Now, the name Elijah means Yahweh is my God. And it's very close to what Jesus said, Eloi, my God. So, okay, you could maybe figure it out, but they missed it. He wasn't calling Elijah. No. People will misunderstand. People may not get it when you're in that place of doubt. People might want to come in and want to help you out and expect you to just snap out of it. Or others might want to stand around and watch to see what happens. Well, let's see this good Christian here. Will he lose his faith? Or will he be rescued with a miracle? Let's see what happens. That's what they stood back to see as Jesus hung on that cross. But you've got to be alone with your doubts. You can't worry about what other people are thinking. You can't be concerned that they're thinking all these things. And yet, of course, you can't get it out of your head. Again, the scriptures come in helpful. In Psalm 42, verses 9 and 10, the psalm goes on to say, I say to God, my rock, why have you forgotten me? Why must I go about mourning, oppressed by the enemy? My bones suffer mortal agony as my foes taunt me, saying to me all day long, where is your God? As you doubt, and you're trapped in those doubts, you feel awful. And not only that, you feel awful that you feel awful. You know in your head you shouldn't be like this. And you worry about what others must be thinking, about what a poor excuse for a Christian you are. But you've got to be alone with your doubts. Forget what the crowds might say or think. Even if you are fortunate enough to have an understanding friend, even if others are there standing with you, you may still feel alone and abandoned. That was the experience of Elijah. You see, Elijah felt exactly that. He cried out to God saying, I'm the only one left and they're out to kill me, and oh, woe is me. Little did Elijah know that there were 7,000 others, God told him, that were right there with him. But even though others may be with us, we still feel alone. Now, if we stop there, it all looks pretty bleak. Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? And then he dies, abandoned and alone. His doubts were not assuaged. He's hopeless and sad. Doesn't look very good. But Luke, in the Gospel of Luke reports for us one more statement that Jesus makes, just as he breathes his last. In Luke 23:46, Jesus, just with his dying breath, says, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Do you see the contrast there? Jesus went from, my God, why have you forsaken me, to then, just maybe a minute later, maybe just seconds later, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. You faith your doubt by trusting despite your doubt. You got to look to the Father, not to your feelings. You see, despite Jesus' feelings, God had forsaken him. Despite his circumstances, he's dying on a cross. Jesus trusted God and his word. You see, everything that he was feeling, God, you've forsaken me. You've left me alone here. I'm dying all alone. That really wasn't the case. You see, God did not forsake Jesus. And Jesus, even in that moment, was still calling out to his Father, believing that he's heard, believing that his Spirit was going to the Father. No, God didn't forsake Jesus. If we continue reading in Psalm 22, which Jesus quotes, which begins with, my God, why have you forsaken me? If we continue on, find in verse 24 of Psalm 22, it says, for he has not despised or disdained the suffering of the afflicted one. He has not hidden his face from him, but has listened to his cry for help. See, in that very psalm, the psalmist has written, my God, why have you forsaken me? And yet he knows, and he writes later, well, God has not disdained my affliction. God has not hidden himself. He is listening, even though it doesn't feel like it. In Psalm 116:15, we read, precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. If God looks with kindness and love upon those that have trusted in him, and he watches over them in their sufferings, how much more did he his own Son? In Hebrews 13:5, it says, God has said, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. God didn't forsake Jesus. Psalm 23:4 says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me, even in the valley of the shadow of death. You see, the fact that we're going through tough times, the fact that we feel alone, the fact that we have all this burden crushing down on us does not negate the fact that God is listening, that God is present, that God is in control. Even in the midst of our doubt, and in the midst of his doubt, Jesus reaches out for his Father and calls out, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." Now, if we were writing the story, right there is where the tables would all turn. All of a sudden, with a trumpet blast, the angels in their array would show up, and they would defeat the Roman soldiers there. And Jesus, who was hanging there on the cross and whose head had finally bowed in death, will all of a sudden look up and with a little grin pull his hands off of those nails and pop his feet off of the nails and jump down off of the cross and show that he's beaten it all. But that's not what happened. It only got worse. Jesus died. Jesus was buried. Jesus was in the tomb for one day. Jesus in the tomb for 2 days. Jesus in the tomb still on that third day. And then he arose. Only then was it proved that Jesus' faith was not misplaced. You see, when we doubt and we cry out to God and we are honest about our doubts and we cry out and we call to him even in the midst of those doubts and against all that we're feeling and all that we have within us, and we just say, "Well, God, I'm just going to give it over to you." Even when we do that, it might still get worse before it gets better. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how bad it gets. Because you see, even death isn't the final word. Jesus conquered death for us. And that's not the end. How do you go from the doubt of my God, why have you forsaken me?" to the faith of, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit"? You hang on to the scriptures despite your feelings. You see, God's word does not change. Our feelings can deceive us. That changes all the time. Your feelings are, they can be a lot like going into a fun house. And you go in that fun house and they got all the funky mirrors, and the one mirror that makes you look all squat and short and wide, and then the other mirror that stretches you out tall and stuff, and nothing is as it seems. And then you go into the room that's all tilty and cockeyed, and there's a trough of water there, and it looks like the water's flowing uphill. You have to hang on to something solid, something outside your present surroundings and your present experience. You've got to hang on to the Lord and his word. And no matter how it feels, you've got to know God has not abandoned you.